welcome to the Pop Art Hunter channel, and today we're going to be doing a framing job. You might have seen the video before. I unboxed a really cool piece I was very excited about. It is a Keymaster multi-cell setup from Charlotte's Web. It features Templeton, kind of log rolling on a piece of corn, corn on the cob, corn on the cob, and he's kind of, doing this little spinny mount, and they got liquid and bubbly. So we're going to be framing that today. And this is not the most complex frame job that's ever happened in the world. I don't want to take credit for doing anything innovative, but it's a more complex frame job because it does involve a multi-cell setup. It does involve a Keymaster background. It does involve multiple layers and trying to make sure things align and fit properly. It is a longer piece, and so that sometimes has its own challenges with lining things up, getting it in the frame, checking, and trying to look at it without things falling and kind of fumbling apart. So we're going to go through, and I'm going to show you the whole process from start to finish of what I do to frame these particular pieces, and hopefully you enjoy. Let's get started. All right, we're going to be framing this Templeton Keymaster setup with multiple cells, and we've got a custom-made frame and the materials to go ahead and put that together. We got some UV filtered acrylic for the front. We've got some museum rag mat, both for the backing and also the mats that'll go in between each of the cells and the layers. That's a 4-ply. We also have some archival tape. I've got some gloves in case I need to wear those, which I'm sometimes bad about that, but especially for this, since it has a cell and since it's such an old cell, we'll make sure that we wear that for that. For this, one of the things that we're going to have to do is make sure this cell is in a spot where we can actually frame it separately from the others, and I can tell, or I know because I opened it, that we have some tape at the tops there. So we're actually going to go ahead and do that first. So we're actually going to go ahead and get this cell detached from that Keymaster background. And so I'm just going to assess here exactly how that's done. So it seems as though there's a piece of tape right here in the corner and also right here in the corner. And it seems it's done all the way through. So my hope is that I can get this piece of tape started to come off. And then once I remove it, I think all the pieces should hopefully separate. So what I like to do is very carefully take a knife, and I'm just going to slowly try to make a small incision in the tape. And usually with a little bit of, I was going to say force, but you don't want to be forceful with it. Usually with just a little bit of pressure or force to pull up a little bit, you're able to just detach it very easily. So you don't need to, we want to make sure that we don't, use any sort of major exertion because we don't want things to go through the cell. But like with anything, once you make that first little perforation, oftentimes it will just release itself. And so I'll make a little small incision on each side to ensure that we can get that off. Let me get this up here. And just, again, ever so lightly, because we don't want to make any damage whatsoever. There you go. And that popped off. So now that that is off, now we can assess the cells themselves to see exactly how they're connected. So as I mentioned, and as I thought, these are actually fairly well separated from each other. They were just being held together by that piece of tape and, kind of by themselves. And so what's really nice about these is, they are not stuck together, which is great, especially cells being so old. You would expect they might have some sticking. So the one thing that we're going to have to do with this is we're going to have to get this lined up with a particular cell. The spot actually that was taped in. And even if you thought, well, I think that, you should have left them on the particular drawing and you shouldn't put pieces in between. The thing about this is this was actually put in the wrong location. So where it was actually taped together was actually the wrong spot for this particular scene in the movie, because this pan was used in multiple different frames within that same scene, and they do use different parts of it. And so it was actually in the wrong spot. So I would have removed it anyway. So it's a good thing that I did it now, in my opinion. So now we will be ready to put it in the right location later. So now we're going to put that aside. And we're going to open up the rest of our frame components. Now, I went ahead and opened this up from the larger box before I started this video because I had a lot of different components. I'd ordered multiple frames, etc. And so I wanted to make sure that we didn't take too long to do an unboxings. But we're actually going to go ahead and open this all up and get it prepared so that we have everything in order for when we're actually going to do the framing. Now, this one, there's a lot more components to it. This is going to be much heavier of a piece. We have the 4-ply museum rag mat back. It's just a plain white. I like to use the plain white on the backs of things. I think it differentiates between these. It makes it look a little bit more crisp and white. And then you can also, if you needed to, you could write on these. I use stickers in the upper right corner, but you have some flexibility with that. And since you're using rag mat and everything else, I like to use rag mat whenever it's touching any portion of the piece. And I also like consistency, and and that I usually spend a little bit more than I should, even on some pieces. If there's a reproduction drawing as an example, sometimes I'll even use the rag mat on there just to be consistent with my frame so they all look the same, even though you don't see the back of the frame. If I went to resell and I were to sell a bulk, they look the same and they don't have any acidic elements like corrugated cardboard or something like that. And so on the back of it, I will still use, even though it's touching only the production background, or the reproduction background, I'll still put that rag mat. Sometimes not, but most of the times I do. I like consistency. So we got the backing, and then we actually have multiple, and hopefully I ordered the right amount and they're the correct size, but 1, 2, 3, 4 different layers of mats here. And so that will be used to then separate each individual layer of the Cels as well as that Keymaster background. So we have multiple of those. And then we also have the UV protected acrylic. And so I'm going to actually pull up the corner of each side of this. This side is always the worst to try to get the corner up. It takes a little bit of finesse here. And we get that up. And this side is usually just a smidgen better. All right, so we're going to lift that up. So I always try to do the more difficult side first. Not that it's difficult, it just takes a little bit of finesse here. I don't know why this seems to stick a little bit more firmly on this side than the side with the logo and the company tape. Maybe I'm just making it up. Okay. So we got that removed. So now we're going to actually put this in the frame. Make sure we get it inside. Sometimes you have to finesse a little bit. These tabs will sometimes hold it in place. So you gotta always go from the front side and make sure that they're pulled up okay. Okay, and as you may have saw me do before, I like to put on a glove, not because I'm trying to protect the acrylic, but because I don't want to get fingerprints on the inside of the glass. Before we actually get done framing a piece, I will always check that there's no major particles or specks on the inside of the glass, because it's much harder to get into a frame once it's all done than it is to just clean off the speck beforehand. So also with fingerprints, I don't want to get fingerprints all over the piece on the inside, because once you notice it, you have to take everything apart. And when you're taking everything apart again, you're more likely to get more fingerprints and specks. And so it's kind of an endless cycle. All right, so we've got this. Now, the difficult part about this piece is going to be actually trying to line up the Cels with the production background, because this is a pretty long frame, and we're dealing with multiple Cels and trying to line them up correctly. And so I'm going to see how I can do that. So I'm going to put the first piece in here, and then we're going to use this reference photo. So this is actually a photo, just a low quality screenshot from the movie that shows exactly where things are. But you can see that, this is the particular scene cell setup. It's perfect. It's identical. And then where it was located on that background is actually a different location. So here I can actually line up. I can say, okay, well, Templeton's foot here is touching this piece of the pie. So I can actually get it fairly well lined up with this particular scene. And so we're actually going to look here and see. I know this is upside down. I'm not framing it this way. We're going to see what part of this is actually visible. So we have this pie right here, and then the Cels contain Templeton and the corn. So let's go ahead and see where the Cels actually fit together. So we'll go ahead and square those up. Okay, and we can see that we probably need to be, if we were doing identical, we would need to be about here. Now the thing about this is we want to try to square this frame up with this top part, because I want to be able to tape correctly between the layers. And so it will be just a slight bit off because we're doing this way. And again, this is for preservation purposes. To make sure that we're framing appropriately, we have layers in between, everything kind of lines up. You're going to see that this is going to be a little bit different than the above. So I'm going to hold this up, and you can see that there's going to be a gap that's a little larger between Templeton's foot and the pie in this area. And so it is going to be just slightly off. But I'm okay with that. I think it's close enough for our purposes. So we'll get rid of that reference for a second. I think roughly it's going to be here. I kind of have a rough idea of where it's gonna go. Okay, so now what we're going to have to do is figure out where we're going to tape and hang this within the piece. So I'm actually going to take this, and I'm going to turn it upside down in this exact location. And I'm going to try to line it up where I want it on the frame. Try to make sure that we overlap at that 1/4 inch roughly on either side. Again, some of this is I'm just eyeballing where I think it might actually be. Okay, so I think that this is roughly a location that we want it to be. Okay, so let's go ahead and try this out and see what it looks like. Okay, so roughly in this spot, and I'm just going to go ahead and pivot these ever so slightly. So I'm thinking about here. So that's just, again, this is not a very scientific way to do things, but it's just a quick way that we tried to line things up the way we wanted it. I just flipped things over. I'm just going to go ahead and see what this looks like in this location. And I'll kind of show you what I'm trying to do here. So we're going to go ahead and put a couple pieces of tape on both sides. And normally in a frame, and again, there's debate on how tightly you should put stuff, how many pieces of tape, what kind of tape, etc. I like to put at least on 2 sides tape. And sometimes I will just put 1 piece of tape in every corner. Sometimes I will put it on the sides. I just make a best judgment depending on the piece that I'm working with. But I just put these 4 pieces of tape, and that's going to serve, try to help us frame things correctly. And then what I'm going to do, because I think it's going to be far easier to line up the next pieces of this than it is going to be to line up the background with the entire piece. So I'm actually going to kind of cheat here a little bit, and I'm going to do the next piece as the background and tape it to the frame appropriately. And so here I like to kind of put it below just the top margin here, and I can make sure that it's lined up on the sides, and then you can try to inch things up about the same amount here to line it up. So I think that is pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and put a few pieces of tape on here as well. And we will fix up how many pieces of tape and how it hangs a little bit later. I just want to kind of put a couple so that I can line things up. Right. So I'm only doing this temporarily, where I'm going to put this backing on just to try to hold things in place a little bit more. This is a bigger, longer frame, and so this will try to help make sure things don't move and shift around too much as I do this. So what I'm looking for here I'll hold the back together, is does this line up roughly where I want it? And I think that it sort of does. I mean, it seems as though that's pretty good. I think I could possibly go up on this side right over here or down on this side with that backing just ever so slightly. I'm trying to consider what I would like to do. Okay, so let's take a look here. I'm actually gonna turn this completely around. Okay, so this can be removed. That's just temporary. All right, so I believe that again I can go up or down slightly. Let me make sure I got the sides correct here. So yeah, I'm just looking at, there's some bubbling here, so I can kind of see how closely things are. You know, I don't think it's too bad. I think that's probably good enough. I think I'm just going to leave it like that. I think that's actually not a bad job. I mean, you're not going to get these things 100% precise. You don't know all the methods that they used and things that they kind of had to adjust and rig up. And so you want to get it as close as you can to that actual production cell, but you also want to preserve it and ensure that you are doing things in the best way for framing and making sure things are secure as well. And so for the aesthetic of it, anybody looking at this piece, I doubt they're going to be like, well, it's a millimeter off, and so you need to be, this can't be authentic. That's probably not going to be the case. All right, so I like to do a little bit more tape. And by a little bit, I mean a lot bit more, especially on the Keymaster backgrounds, to ensure that everything is secure. I do a little less generous on the cells themselves, but here I like to make sure things stay in place and try to reduce the rippling. It seems like the paper is a little bit more susceptible to the warping sometimes, but not as susceptible to cracking and splitting and ripping and those types of things. So with the cells themselves, I like to make sure I do a little less tape and a little less tension to make sure that they don't have as many troubles. Yeah, okay, I think this is pretty good. So now you're thinking, well, you only have one cell in there, correct? You're observant. So what I did is I made this back cell, or I made the background just to ensure that it looked okay with that cell in front, because all the other cells are going to go in the same location. And so as I do the next cells, I'm just going to line those up with each other. And so as long as these are lined up together, life should be pretty good. So that's how I'm going to do that. So I'm going to line it up with the other one, but with a layer in between. So let's go to the next layer. It's a little bit harder to see how things line up, but we also have the peg holes. And if anything, and you might disagree. Again, I have a preference for framing to make things look good, but also framing for security and authenticity, and also just a general aesthetic. Most people aren't going to pay as fine attention to some details, so they might not know that this is not the exact millimeter location as it was in the film, but they're going to easily see if the peg holes are not lined up with one another. So even if things got shifted, and you can see this one cell is taped at the bottom, so clearly they made some adjustments or edits to things or decided to use it in other locations and etc. So it might be slightly off, so it doesn't look exactly like it did in the movie. Maybe they made alterations afterwards and tried different things. And so because of that, it might be just slightly off from how it looks in the movie, but I like to make sure that the cells are lined up. So at first glance, at just a tertiary glance at things, you can see that it looks pretty good. Okay. So I put a few more pieces of tape than I normally would on these sides because we're not taping on the other sides, and I want to try to ensure that they're not touching as best as possible between the two layers. In this case, I maybe should have used an 8-ply museum rag mat just so there was a little bit more space in between, but I'm not as concerned about these touching each other and getting damaged in that fashion. Maybe I should be more worried, but I'm in fact not. Take it for what it's worth. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and line this up Yes, I am using one gloved and one ungloved hand. This is just used to touch the edges of things and kind of adjust slightly where the glove cannot as easily do that. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. If I can find the edge of the tape, we will be in business. Okay, so just one more alignment here, making sure. And again, things are never 100% perfect, especially when you put the layers in between. It gives sort of a 3D effect. Move your eyes, it's like this parallax kind of a background things where, the peg holes, depending on what angle you're standing, are not going to look 100% lined up. But if they're significantly off, that you're likely going to notice. So for this piece, I'm just going to give a little bit of a pull here. Just so that it's a little bit more taut and away from that front piece. And actually, I'm going to come back here and just make sure that this one is done appropriately here. Because I feel as though I didn't make as much of an effort there to make sure that it was not touching, it wasn't sagging or drooping in the middle. So I'm just going to go ahead and just do these one more time, just to make sure I have just the slightest bit of tension. Again, you don't want to make these so that it can cause damage in the future, or if the changing humidity and temperatures will ruin it. But you also want to make sure that they're not touching each other so that the paint gets stuck and chips off and all that kind of stuff. So you're striking a balance. You're dealing with some old cells, some old material, and you want to make sure that you're not messing things up. But you got to do the best you can. Sometimes you're not. Eventually everything dies, everything deteriorates, and so you're doing the best you can with the materials you have. All right, so that is all of those pieces together. We're going to go ahead and put the final bit on, which is the background, and we already know that that's where we want it placed because we did it beforehand. Yeah, okay. So now we're going to put the final backing on it. And once again, I never call it quits until I know that we've got everything in alignment and they're good to go. But I'm going to go ahead and get this where it needs to be. I'm going to close a couple tabs. Usually close 2 or 3 on the top. And then maybe 1 or 2 at the bottom here, the sides. And these are actually a little bit more difficult here. I'm just going to use a pair of scissors here to get those down. There's a few more layers in this one, which I did account for in the measurements for the tabs, but sometimes when you're dealing with those tabs, the more layers you get, the more tension you have, and then you have issues. Yeah, okay, so let's take a look at this. As is. That looks really good. I really like this. So we're going to do the wipe off. And I can see that there are just a couple little specks right in here. I don't know if it's going to be easy to see that. There's a few little specks in there. I'm not sure how visible that is on the camera. So I'm actually going to, before I close up shop for all of them, I'm going to make sure I remove those tiny little specks. And again, I just like to ball up the glove that I'm using and just do a little bit of a wipe off here. So just a few little specks. So I try to get them off to the side, and if possible, I can use a little static to get them off completely. And you can never be 100% on these specks. Dust is going to get in. There's going to be little pieces and fragments that fall off from the piece itself, possibly little chips of paint, etc. And so there's, you do the best you can. So I come up from the bottom and I push in the tabs, make sure that they're good. And it looks like all is well there. Okay, so let's go ahead and close these tabs. And the sides seem to be going a lot well. Maybe they used a smaller tab or the placement slightly off on the middle ones here. Okay. Surprised I have any fingertips left from framing things like this. I really should have a tool to do it, but I get impatient and just want to get it done correctly the first time. All right, so I've got most of these closed for our purposes. I'll go through with a tool and get those last few closed to make sure that they're completely tight. Just have a few that I didn't get here, but it's good enough to show the front. All right, look at that. So it looks pretty good. I like it. I think it turned out very well, and I think it's going to look good on my wall. I am so excited with how this turned out. It looks really good. I think it's going to look great on my wall. I'm going to put it next to another Charlotte's Web piece that I have, a larger production background, and I think it's going to look cool next to that. And just alone, I think it's a really cool setup. I love the background. The Keymaster is really great. It has a lot of vibrancy to it. It's, kind of a unique subject matter, and I love Templeton, and so him adding on to the top of that in a multi-cell setup fashion is just really cool. I was happy I was able to get this all separated. I like to not have layers touching each other. I have a couple pieces where that's not really possible because you have such a large production background, and then just a small cell that's used in that fashion, and there's no edges. This had the top and the bottom edge that I was able to use to split the layers up individually, and so I think that's long-term going to preserve and protect it a lot better, and it makes me happy in my tummy. It makes me feel good because, it's just the way I want it. I like to have things a precise and specific way. So hopefully this particular video helped you out to show you what I do in the process of putting these together. I am not an expert by any means, but this is the steps that I like to follow and some tips that I do. So hopefully it helped you. If you have questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, stories, or amusing anecdotes, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I'd be happy to answer and reply to you. And tell me if you've had similar setups or problems with setups or any of those types of things when you're doing framing. So thanks for watching the Pop Art Hunter channel, and we will see you next time.